So I am watching everyone fill up their seats. Welcome back. Um, Before we make introductions, definitely, make sure you have some juice or some water at hand, and maybe you want to take some notes. Maybe you want to write down some contact information for our presenters today, so you can get more in tune with their work and this book we'll be covering today as well. One I've had the pleasure of enjoying, one I didn't even know I needed until I started reading it. Um, so without further ado, welcome everyone back to Quartz. That's Conversations on Race and Policing, the series. Something we do here at CSUSB, presented by the Pfau Library, and our program organizers. I am Marlo Brooks. I am a senior studying English in the College of Arts and Letters here at CSUSB, making sure my mic is on, everyone's hearing me, and I'm not just moving my lips. And yes, everything is going on. All right, so I am joined by none other than Stan Futch, my friend. Tell everyone hi, Stan.
Good afternoon, Stan Futch, community organizer. Glad to be here again on this Wednesday. If you haven't read the book, you gotta pick it up. It's amazing. So I hope you enjoy today's session.
That's right. As Stan noted, we'll be covering Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s, Los Angeles in the 60s. This is going to be a powerful segment tonight, guys, and we are going to be excited for your Q&As. We're going to give our presenters time to talk, which are co-authors of this novel, of this book, I should say, not novel, of this book. And we'll give them their chance to talk about themselves and the work that they do and how this book may have came about. And also, despite that Q&A button, we would love to get to your questions during that segment of the show. And, as we always start things off, we like to pay homage to the land on which CSUSB sits on. So we recognize that California State University of San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the CSUSB community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold CSUSB more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. So we thank you. And today we're gonna jump right in it, guys. We're gonna jump right into this show. So definitely take notes, and if anything sticks out to you, spike that Q&A button. We would definitely have a chance to get to all the questions tonight and have our presenters and as well as our panelists get a chance to give some feedback and some answers to those questions. So without further ado, we're just gonna jump right in. And Mike, I hope you're ready. You're first up in my book. So there you go, Mike.
I can't tell you how delighted I am to be speaking to students on your campus. Although my family lived in Fontana in 1946, there wasn't a hospital, so I was born in San Bernardino. That's what it says very proudly on my driver's license. When we first conceived this project, our greater ambition was not to confine it to the city of Los Angeles or LA County, but to encompass the whole metropolitan galaxy of Southern California. But after our editors started throwing tomatoes at us over the undue length of the volume, we had to sacrifice that. And it's really too bad, because the history of the struggle for racial justice and inequality in the whole Citrus Belt from Monrovia, Pomona, Riverside, and above all the west side of San Bernardino is so important. And there were such big battles fought in San Bernardino over these issues in the face of tremendous police repression and also violence from the racist fringes, which is an integral part of the history of the Inland Empire. When I wrote my first book on LA, City of Quartz, I devoted a chapter to my hometown, Fontana, and to the fact that the year I was born there, the Moore family, which had moved across the color line, which in those days was Foothill Boulevard, were burnt to death by Ku Klux Klan members. A murder that was never really investigated, but hangs today still as a shadow over this part of Southern California. The other thing I want to say at the beginning, before I turn it over to John, is that we conceive this book as a movement history. That is, we wanted to look as deeply as we could into the actual social forces that were active in the struggles of the 1960s, not focused just on celebrity leaders promoted by the media or familiar organizations, but to investigate and find out, you know, who are the people organizing on the streets, in schools, in the factories. So this was intended very much to be a kind of bottom-up history, because so much of the history of the 60s has been written from the standpoint of people made famous for good reasons or bad, or from a handful of organizations, to the neglect of so many other movements and organizations, and also the spontaneous activity that was such a major feature of the scene in the 1960s. And one of the conclusions of our books, one of its major themes, is that not only was Southern California, was kind of greater Los Angeles, is equally or more important than the Bay Area or, big Midwestern college campuses in terms of 60s movements. But it was, in fact, high school students, even junior high school students, community college students, and students in the state university system, who are the real actors here, in a way, are the real heroes of our history. So this is a very different picture that we painted. Although I must emphasize again, it's only a very small part of the mural that I hope that all of us collectively contribute to, including the history of my two birthplaces in the Inland Empire. Thank you.
Yes, John, you could jump right in there.
Well, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a kind of a big book. You can, do your upper body exercises with it in the morning. Officially it's 800 pages long, but really there's only 640 pages of this are text. The rest is footnotes and bibliographies and notes and stuff like that. So let's not exaggerate how long it is. There's two parts of that I want to describe. The way this is structured, kind of the core, the spine, the heart of the book is the struggles, the organizations, the campaigns by Black people in Los Angeles, starting right around 1960, inspired very much by the sit-in movement in the Deep South, led by college students, starting in North Carolina in the winter of 1960. That's, what is that, 60 years ago, 61 years ago. Inspired students in Los Angeles first to fight for integrated housing, integrated schools in Los Angeles. There was several years of nonviolent direct action in Los Angeles, modeled on what lessons had been learned in the South. Then came the explosion, the Watts Uprising of August 1965, which kind of transformed the whole United States, but also especially Los Angeles, and especially the Black movements of Los Angeles, which then took a more radical turn. This is the period when we see the rise of the Black Panthers, Ron Karenga's US organization, several other efforts to unify Black organizing and fighting for equality in Los Angeles. So the kind of the core of the book, the spine of the book is, and I should add, this leads us to the high school blowouts in which the kids, we call them the kids, were so important and so unrecognized. Not college kids, younger than university kids in many cases. Around that core, we write about many other movements, the women's liberation movement, the Chicano movement. The whole idea of the Chicano as something different from Mexican American immigrants arises in Southern California in this period, and is an important part of the story. The gay rights movement, of course, the movement in the military, which we wish we could have written more about, the Asian American movement. We try to find the grassroots presence of all of these other groups, which were inspired by and in many ways modeled themselves on the civil rights examples of the early 60s and then the mid and the late 60s. So we have many different movements, and there's one thing that connects all of them, and that is the police. The police were against all of them. They were against the gays, the women, the Chicanos, the high school kids. It's kind of an amazing thing to see just how extensive and this was, and how long the struggle was to get the LAPD under control. And it's continuing today. The past summer, you may have noticed, we saw the largest protest movement in American history, Black Lives Matter, raising the same issues that were raised in the 60s, and of course were raised well before the 60s, about what is politely called police misconduct. Remains in the headlines today. Just in today, this week, UCLA has, cooperating with the ACLU of Southern California, has won a huge lawsuit to get 177 boxes of the archives of the LAPD, which have been kept secret since the 70s. The court said they have to be turned over to the public. UCLA is going to house them. There's going to be an archive of the age of incarceration based at UCLA, headed by Kelly Little Hernandez. So the events of this past summer really changed the history of Los Angeles, including what we're going to learn about the history of earlier decades. That's my opening statement.
That's great. That's great work. And I have to ask what inspired, if you haven't already spoken on it, what inspired you guys to start this project?
I should say, one of the people who reviewed this book went back and read all of Mike's work and found that I had done an interview with Mike about 20 years ago where he said, my day job is writing a movement history of LA in the 60s. So Mike has had this idea for a very long time. He asked me to join him and help him finish it about 5 years ago. Mike, I think you should explain the rest.
My reason for writing this book was twofold. The less important reason was the desire to provide a kind of alternate history and framework for historical interpretation to that offered by most accounts of the 1960s, particularly those that centered on the right or left. But the really compelling reason was deeply personal, which is the obligation to record the lives and ideas of people I loved and who were so deeply influential on me. And the book's dedicated to one of those people, a South Central activist who for 6 years unflaggingly went out every day to organize and fight the power, named Levi Kingston. And he knew I was writing the book, and we interviewed him and so on. And I promised he would see the manuscript of it, but he died just before the publication of the book. But he was an enormous influence on my life, as were all the other people that John and I talk about in our acknowledgments.
I got a million questions. I thoroughly enjoyed as much as I've read so far, because it's a big book, like you said. And I actually read it like a novel. I really did. I good guys and bad guys, and you were rooting for people in the novel, and so it was like heartfelt, because you wanted the good guys to win, and the bad guys seemed to always prevail. And so one of the villains to me in the book that lasted for so long was Chief Parker. So I saw him and I watched him, and I'm a historian a little bit, and I saw his control much like the FBI director, and he ran LA like I've just got a block on name. J. Edgar Hoover ran the country. He actually locked down that city and got away with it for so long. So in most novels, you want to see the bad guy get his just desserts, and I won't be give any information, but the end for him was just dessert. So that was I thoroughly enjoyed it, and as we go on, I got a million questions. So Marlo, go ahead and take over. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think I remember reading you coined them celebrity villains, I believe, in the book. And and that was so on point, the way that they were described, the people who were responsible for all these misdoings and biases and just lawlessness. They were celebritized in a sense, and we don't see that nowadays. We see more of a is infamous the word, because they're only made famous for the wrongdoing now. That's when they get all the shame on the internet now. But back then it was almost popularity contest with the with the way they were running the show. The book was such an honest read, like everything about the book. You feel like you're right as because I have the audiobook, so as I'm listening to it, I feel like I'm in the 60s. Now I'm from Florida. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. But this book was a chronological masterpiece that fits so well into the life that I'm living now that it made me feel like I was from California, or it definitely answered a lot of questions. Yes, go ahead, John.
One of Mike's points at the outset of this project was that Los Angeles in the 60s actually has a lot in common with southern cities in the 60s.
I read that. And
Mike, okay, tell them about
yes.
this.
Well, and in one incident we discussed in the book on a chapter of the Los Angeles activists who joined the freedom rides in the South in 1961, 1962, is one of them's arrested in Mississippi and sent to the infamous Parchment Farm prison. And in the process, in course of being processed by the prison officials, looks up and sees a big recruiting poster for the LAPD on the wall. And the thing is that Chief Parker, although we literally danced in the streets when he dropped dead, he institutionalized himself and his ideas, which gave him a long life after death, well through the 1990s. Parker was the chief rival of J. Edgar Hoover, or maybe the other way around. And Parker was a Catholic, a reactionary Catholic, who had close relations with the Kennedy brothers, and had hoped to succeed Hoover
Hoover.
and the Kennedy administration, except that Hoover had even bigger confidential files than Chief Barker with which to blackmail the Kennedy, the Kennedy brothers. There are three turning points in our history that are really important. The first was in 1963. In the midst of this epic Birmingham summer, when the civil rights movement reached its crescendo in the struggle against this unbelievably racist regime that dominated the South's leading industrial city. But what were originally solidarity actions, protests in support of Birmingham, and several northern cities turned into major freedom struggles that modeled themselves after the Birmingham freedom movement, and whose slogan was, not civil rights in the future, but freedom now, absolutely now, this summer. And so a United Civil Rights Committee, the coalition developed in LA, very broadly inclusive, had NAACP, the ACLU, Urban Leagues, SNCC, various Black student groups involved in it. And it was totally defeated. And the symbol of that defeat, above all, it was defeated in winning any of its fundamental demands about equality in housing, employment, and education. But the final nail in the coffin of peaceful change was when, in the fall of 1964, overwhelming majority of white voters in California voted to repeal the landmark fair housing law that had been passed in Sacramento, authored by the great Black civil rights leader, Byron Mumford in Oakland. And that set the ground and made the rebellion in August 1965, the so-called Watts riot, not only inevitable, but probably necessary. Then there follows the second period, represented by the Black Congress, which was again a united front of Black activists, particularly younger activists, a whole array of organizations, but more radical than the Civil Rights Committee of 1963. And this is a spectacular moment of Black unity, and what was essentially the beginning of the formation of an independent Black political power in Los Angeles. But as John can explain later, the defeat of Tom Bradley. Tom Bradley was the Black African-American policeman who built a unique coalition of West Side liberals, the African-American community. His defeat in 1969 in the mayoral election, despite polls that showed him the clear-out favorite, his defeat by the right-wing populist, kind of Trump before Trump, Mayor Sam Yorty, who at the last moment just deluged white voters with, Tom Bradley's a member of the Black Panther Party, Tom Bradley's gonna come get your mama kind of stuff. That foreclosed, once again, any kind of obvious peaceful or political route to fundamental change, and was immediately followed by this extraordinary wave of oppression, not just the LAPD, the sheriffs, and above all, the district attorney's office, working hand in glove with the FBI. And it really became a life and death struggle. And tragically, all the energy that groups like the Black Student Union, the Black Panther Party, the Chicano Moratorium people, all the energy that they wanted to invest in building community struggles and community unity had to be devoted in a desperate fight against the this coordinated, almost unparalleled wave of repression. So very dark at that moment.
And then Tom Bradley went through it again when he ran for governor. And so, so it was,
Indeed.
you're so right. The exact same thing happened when he ran for governor. He was a sure front runner, and at the end, the propaganda got the white vote out, and he lost to Wilson. And so, so many parallels. There was one part in a lot of parts in the book, but there's this one part that I need some clarification on. And I was just so baffled that it kept popping up all over the place. And that was communism. If you were making headway, they turned around and called you a communist. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Well, I was a communist. I joined the Communist Party at Southern California at the same time that Angela Davis did. And I joined it precisely because the Southern California Communist Party condemned and opposed the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And because at the time I thought a communist reformation was possible. The idea of joining and adopting the line of the New York comrades with their completely supine adoration of the Soviet Union, none of the young communists in LA were into that. But the Communist Party had a unique presence in Southern California. It refused to go completely underground or into hiding. It maintained the framework of the organization it built up during the Second World War, which was a broad presence in all the minority communities within some of the skilled Hollywood unions, and above all in the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And it had a unique leader, Dorothy Healy, who I acknowledge is probably the most important intellectual and moral influence on my life. We fought like cats and dogs because, I was a person of the New Left, and I thought she was an old revisionist because she was urging things like getting us to vote against, Ronald Reagan. But it's the one place in the country, and there may be some exceptions, including the South, but it's really the one place in the country where there is an important, not only continuity, but dialogue between what was called the old left and the new left. And Dorothy presided over the whole progressive movement. I mean, you go to her little house in South Central LA, and you walk in and you never know who you'd find there. Maybe one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, or one of the key peace activists, certain Democratic officials who couldn't get enough of her advice and an understanding. And that's why the party could attract someone like Angela Davis, who otherwise, I conceive it almost impossible Angela could have joined the party anywhere else. And two other people figured in an absolutely decisive way on all this. So, their memory needs to be recovered. And that's Franklin and Kendra Alexander, who were, Franklin came from a family of, I think, Alabama sharecroppers, a radical Black family that had been involved from the 30 onwards. Kendra was recruited out of, I think, community college in the first place. And they were incredibly influential people. They were the closest friends of Angela and helped recruit her to the party. And the fact that Dorothy Healy actually encouraged the younger Black comrades, create your own organization, your own club. Don't pay attention to us. Figure out what you want to do for yourself. This kind of interaction and kind of diversity generations really didn't happen anywhere else in the country that I'm aware of.
And I just want to say one other thing about Dorothy. Dorothy Healy, we all love Dorothy Healy. But it wasn't just people inside the left. She had a radio program starting pretty early in the 60s on KPFK with the bold name Communist Commentary. I mean, this is the era when McCarthyism is still alive and well. And she's got a radio program called Communist Commentary, where she interviewed, among other people, her mother, one of the founders of the Communist Party of the United States. This got KPFK in a lot of trouble. They were subject to a challenge to their license and to their funding, but they survived all that. And then Dorothy ran for county tax assessor in 1966. Mike, how many votes did Dorothy Healy get?
I think she got 78,000 votes, and she was the first one to warn everybody that unless the left takes possession of this question of property taxes, the right will own it. And so she got, it was a fantastic vote.
Another thing that you talk a lot about, and I know a lot of it was going on, and that is the level of police brutality. It was not, I mean, they were literally beating people to death almost and locking them up at will. But the level of brutality that was administered to the protesters and anyone they could, and the harassment from the police, as reading it as a novel, they were the villains. So talk a little bit about, I mean, where did that come from? That their anger towards anyone that opposed them.
Let me just say, by way of introduction, recovering this history is not an easy task, because the main source of the main archive of the news in Los Angeles in the 60s is the LA Times, which was a huge operation at that point, but very reactionary in its editorial control and very pro-police. So if you read the LA Times, what you learn is that Black people tried to kill the police, Black people were armed, Black people were threatening. We had to go to fortunately, LA had a thriving Black community press in the 60s. And they had real professional, talented reporters out on the streets telling what was really going on. And that was the source of a lot of the information we were able to put together about the big events that were extremely well known in South Central, but unknown in the white neighborhoods of LA. And Mike, you can explain some of this.
Well, one of the reasons that people rebelled after this kind of brutal police stop in the sweltering summer of 1965, when LAPD officers manhandled a young Black woman, was the fact that some months earlier, a young Black woman was picked up by the police and raped in a police car by two cops. Everybody knew about this south of the Santa Monica Freeway. The California Eagle, I think it was in its last year, devoted, columns to this. So everybody was angry. And this was absolutely key to understanding what happened. Though readers of the LA Times, or people who listen to the generally right-wing news, television and radio in Southern California, apart from KPFK, would have been totally unaware of it. White people just had totally imaginary views of what was going on. They didn't understand. Listen, when I graduated from high school in 1964, if you weren't immediately drafted, a white working class kid like me, you could write your own ticket. You want to work in an auto plant? You want to, make tires? You want to drive heavy duty trucks, which is what I did. You want to work on the longshore? It was a full employment economy. It was extraordinary. Unemployment amongst Black youth in South Central particularly in the Watts district, was increasing. It had doubled in the period that it was disappearing anywhere else. So that kind of endless summer, my last years in high school, were really kind of deep winter, for kids in South Central. Added to that, of course, was the fact that the police, by picking up people on random and criminalizing every act, loitering was one universal cause. Compiling criminal records made it impossibly difficult for young Black males to get jobs. Similarly, on the East Side, amongst young Chicanos. So the LAPD is not only enforcing LA's version of apartheid and cracking heads, beating people to death, it was also the major force behind rising unemployment in a time of unprecedented prosperity.
A major reason why we convene here every week, and one common question that seems to pop up many a times with our viewers is, how can they get involved? Now, one thing that this book detailed was the involvement of everyday people that got out there with no experience and started immobilizing and organizing and campaigning and everything they can do to fight for the rights, the equal rights of Black people, for education, for jobs, for housing. I think that one thing our viewers, if they get a chance to read this book, would take, that we got to keep in mind that this was the 60s, well before the 60s and throughout the 60s and the 70s, and they were fighting with tools way less than what we have now, and mobilizing and making and what I always say, changing national climates, just here in LA. And you said that this book started off as a Southern California historical base, but I got a lot of that context out of reading the books. I got a lot of Southern California history, especially talking about all American cities and just all these different things that we've witnessed here in California. San Bernardino was an all-American city at one point. But one thing our readers and our viewers could take from this book is how to get involved and why you get involved. And it's not easy to get out there on the front line every day and fight for a cause that you strongly believe in, because it can take a lot out of you, and it could question whether you do you still believe in this cause. Is it worth my head getting cracked every day? But when you see the fire in these young people lives that were out there on the front line every day, from the bus boycotts to the sit-ins to just the women organizations that started popping up and taking over. And that's what I've read so much of this context. I'm like, wow, with the tool, they didn't have none of the tools that we have now, that we get out there and use. We rely too much on the internet anyway, to get our point across. When the type of foot soldiering that they were doing back in the day, that's true immobilizing, that's true campaigning, that's true protesting. And I think a lot of our viewers can get a lot of that history back with that type of with this read alone. I think it's very important.
Well, Mike and I, you may have noticed, are old white guys, and what we saw this past summer was something nobody imagined would happen. A year ago, nobody thought this was going to happen. And what happened was the largest protest movement in American history. And it was everywhere. It was, as you say, it was much better than anything we had in the 60s. It was much more diverse, it was everywhere. I mean, there was even a Black Lives Matter march in Newport Beach. Now, Newport Beach is the whitest, most Republican, wealthiest place in the most Republican county in California. If there can be a Black Lives Matter in Newport Beach, we're in a new phase of history. But as I say, Mike and I, we're kind of old, but and this is very much a movement of young people. But Mike has high school kids who were part of this, and I always love to hear about Mike's kids and how they got involved. Mike, I'm going to pass this over to you to tell some stories.
Yeah, I mean the media gave exorbitant attention to young white people who were coming out to support Black Lives Matter. But what I found most striking in Southern California as a whole, but in the milieu of my own, family, was the unity that existed between new immigrants of all kinds and Latino kids with the black movement. My two younger kids identify as Mexican with their mother. They're still in high school, virtual high school, if that's. And then their friends got involved. Their friends are not, they go to an inner city high school, San Diego High. Their friends are not a family like ours, radical posters and books from wall to wall. They're just, sons and daughters of Somali immigrants, Mexican fathers who spend their days mowing lawns and landscaping. And their whole set, without, I think, hardly a moment's reflection, immediately joined the Black Lives Matter protest. And I mean, still, my 17-year-old daughter walks around the house and F the police t-shirt, which I try and get her to take it off because I said, you can't go outside and wear this. And she says, what's wrong with you, Dad? I thought you were a radical. All the kids are wearing these t-shirts. I mean, we're seeing a new generation in the making that is unique and fundamentally different from many other generations, precisely because of the degree of real unity and shared values between all youth of color and new immigrants. And yeah, a lot of white kids as well. And for the first time since since the election of 1910, there's also a mass constituency for socialism, whatever socialism means to people. And you can't read Marx and very easily find out what socialism is. But millions of young people, a majority of generation under the age of 30, who believe there must be some alternative to the society we live in and to the elevation of greed, profit above everything else. The problem is there's not really kind of national organization or national coalition, but the grassroots, are thriving. And I'm a person who's often caricatured as the worst kind of pessimist, prophet of doom. I have enormous optimism for this coming generation. And by the way, the high school protests we talked about in the 60s, they've never stopped happening. I mean, we had enormous high school blowouts over Prop 180, Pete Wilson's attempt to strip away all rights, including ability to go to public school for kids whose parents didn't have citizenship or passports. And after that, in Black men, go across the country, I would say here in San Diego, that high school kids were majority of the Black Lives Matter protesters. This is not coming out of UCSD, just like in the 60s. The real protests, were not at UCLA or USC. In high schools and community colleges together with the state universities, I mean, are really the bedrock in this state. And one of California's greatest progressive accomplishments was to create this community college system, which, by the way, I'm an old, sick, retired guy, so all my medical insurance is through my wife, who's a very proud, active community college member, currently fighting to disband the community college police force in San Diego colleges. Is totally unnecessary and largely discriminatory in its actions. So defund the police.
Yeah, the freedom fighters, I remember in the books, at one point they were called, they were going on a suicide mission. It got so bad. And I just remember reading that, and yet people were still volunteering to go on these bus rides to the South, and they were getting beat up pretty bad, and they ended up calling them suicide missions. But John, you stole something from me when I asked you a question, and I want to get back to it. And that is, although the police to me were the bad guys, I think worse than the police were the press. And you mentioned the LA Times, and I mean, they were brutal. Anything that happened, they would twist it to make the students and the protesters the bad guys. Could you talk on that a little bit?
Well, the LA Times had been a fiercely reactionary force. Unionism was their greatest cause was opposition to labor unions at the newspaper, but that led to opposition to progressive forces everywhere. And it was the family that controlled the paper made sure that they followed the Republican Party, the LAPD, and they also had a close alliance with the Catholic Church in Los Angeles, which was another great reactionary institution of this era. I mean, they, kind of supported each other and formed a fierce front that was ran Los Angeles time. At the same time, the LA Times did employ a lot of serious, professional, talented journalists who did what they could. I mean, we were able to find a lot of good stuff sort of buried in the community, in the neighborhood news reports. They covered Los Angeles a lot more thoroughly then than they do today. So on the one hand, you had this fiercely reactionary editorial policy. The front page was, a right-wing nightmare. Inside, if you look closely, you could learn about what was going on in LA. And that actually started to change in the 60s when there was a change in the family that owned the paper. The next generation wasn't as bad as the founding generation. And, that's part of the history of the 60s too. And also the Catholic Church changed over the course of the 60s and the 70s. PD took a lot longer to change, and we're still working on it.
Yeah, you're so right. Mike, in the book, a lot of these organizations, the Black Panthers, the US, and all those groups that came together, I think behind the scenes, there was financing involved, and there was monies being moved around and so on, and people that had come together with another group didn't feel like they were getting their share of the money and so on and so on. And talk about the demise of a lot of these organizations, because they fizzled out, a lot of infighting and so on and so on.
Well, US, which means like the pronouns us, was a movement founded by Maulana Karenga, who's still alive and active today. And he'd been a leading student activist at LA City College in the early civil rights protests and activities in 1960 and 61. He founded his group he widely read in African culture and history. He spoke Swahili. I think he was a graduate student at UCLA in Swahili. And he kind of cobbled together, he made a synthesis of what he felt were core ideas, African ideas about unity, community, and so on. And he recruited, as did the Black Panther Party, often out of street gangs in South Central, which had created a ceasefire the minute the LA rebellion started in August. But the gangs represented, really the most militant parts of what James Brown called the new breed. And this is where, if you want, courageous, tough people, you recruit from them. But it ended up that us and the Black Panthers kind of recruited from rival gangs. But in the first period, in 66, 67, there was unity. US was the organization that sponsored one of the biggest Free Huey protests, Free Huey Newton protests, for example. They worked together in something called the Black Congress, along with a number of other groups, including the first Black Student Union groups at Cal State LA, the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party with the Alexanders and Angela Davis. There were tensions between them and conflicts, obviously. The Panthers thought that the Afrocentrism of us was in danger of becoming a cult. Karenga was very suspicious of the Panthers' embrace of the left, including the white left. But, they still acted and fought together. And this period was, in a way, a kind of, high point of the whole 60s, at least in the African-American community. But inside, relations between the two groups and between leaders of each group individually were being poisoned by the FBI, working hand in hand with the LAPD and the district attorney, spreading the kind of most malicious of lies about Karenga on one side and the Panther leadership on the other. And this led to a tragic event, which was murder, assassination of two of the most important local Panther leaders, John Huggins and Al Prentice, Bunchy Carter. Bunchy in particular, who was an ex-paratrooper, who'd been a renowned warrior in the Slauson Street Gang, had been a peacemaker, okay? He was totally unafraid to drive across town and sit down with the US people. And the circumstances of these events is still a little enigmatic. But taking Mamu Baraka, the poet Leroy Jones's testimony, because Karenga was in Newark, New Jersey, hanging with Baraka when the killings occurred. He was totally floored. He was devastated, by the shootings. But yeah, when he returned to LA, continued to attack Panthers, and Panthers retaliated. But then this was followed by doing the same thing within the organizations, telling some Panthers that so-and-so was actually a police plant, or so-and-so was having an affair with your girlfriend, or said this about your family, or was stealing money or so on. And you could see the cracks beginning to open in an organization, and this is sometimes forgotten, organization that had enormous potential to grow. Before the Panthers were disrupted and repressed in Southern California, they were gaining new members every day, young Black veterans returning from Vietnam, getting jobs in the post office, auto plants, and so on. The composition was changing. It was no longer just an organization of street kids. It was an organization representing young Black workers and many other groups behind. And of course, this story has been told, many times. But once you had all the repressive forces acting in unity with a conscious plan to destroy, first of all, the unity of different Black organizations, then to disrupt those organizations internally. Tragedy was compounded by, police murders and what essentially became a civil war in the Black Panther Party with very tragic results.
I wasn't getting that same infiltration when it came to Malcolm X and the NOI. I didn't see the government infiltrating the NOI the way that they did a lot of these Black organizations. Is there any reason for that?
Not infiltrating who?
The Nation of Islam.
The Nation of Islam, yeah.
Well, so much of this remains in the realm of speculation. But by 1963, certainly by 1964, Hoover decided that the Nation of Islam was not the main enemy. It was Malcolm X. Because Malcolm X had a distinctive vision of Black liberation struggle. He saw it as an integral part of a global liberation struggle of colonial and oppressed people. This was far more frightening to Hoover and the FBI than a group based in Chicago that struck a militant image, but in a sense was, it accepted some of their own members. The Nation of Islam, was never physically aggressive or violent. In 1963, the police murdered and rampaged the LA Mosque of the Nation in Islam. It's just astonishing, sadistic thing. For instance, they lined up members of the Nation of Islam and deliberately shot men in their testicles, and and so on. But Malcolm was the serious problem. He had to be stopped at all costs. And of course, he died in the arms of a guy who was actually a plant by the LA. He was a New York, police officer. And no, it was never really investigated. And everybody knew it was coming for months and months before that, as you see in any of the films or documentaries about Malcolm X. But it's perhaps hard today to realize what an enormously vigorous, exciting figure, what a clear, powerful mind Malcolm X had, how important he was. And in some cases, history usually doesn't depend really on great leaders. It depends on great movements. But his loss, far more than that of the two Kennedy brothers, had immeasurable and tragic consequences.
We're at that portion of our show where we get a check-in by one of our very own, Mary Texeira. Mary, did you have a question for our presenters today?
And I'm really sorry, my internet has been going in and out, and you don't want to see my fan.
You're on in Texas, are you?
Yeah, I feel like I am. I have to let these two men know, though, that I have been an admirer, should I just say a fangirl, for many, many years. I know John from KPFK and love your voice and what you have to say. And Mike, you occasionally appear on KPFK, but I know you more from City of Quartz. which is just, if you have not read that book, it is just phenomenal. And it reads like a novel. I especially love the part where you describe Nancy Reagan going on a drug raid. You want to tell people about that? That happened in the 60s. No, it happened in the what, 70s or 80s, I guess, huh?
What was this?
Nancy Reagan going on a drug raid in LA.
Oh yeah,
That is like the best part of the whole book. Can you tell people about that?
Well, you know, the war on drugs is, of course, the longest and most destructive war in American history. It's cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It's destroyed communities, you know, at the base.
Yeah.
But it also revealed how really thoroughly evil the people who created it were. And Nancy Reagan was, you know, no wallflower, no, you know, shy first lady. She and her father had converted Ronald Reagan into a staunch conservative. And she was really a bad news figure in every way, reminiscent of some of the middle-aged or older white women who played crucial roles in the Trump campaign. And doing what you might call slumming, like liberal reformers did in the 19th century. Here we are in the heart of darkness, you know, South Central Los Angeles, you know, West Philadelphia or something. Can you believe?
Yeah, she even had on
how these people live. And they're selling drugs that are destroying the country. That's a real problem in our country. It's not on youth unemployment or discrimination, any of that. It's drugs. We should put everybody in jail for 100 years.
Yeah.
And of course, this is very much a bipartisan policy. Our current president has an unsavory role in passing these laws. And there's still thousands and thousands of people incarcerated or whose lives have been totally blemished and or become unemployable thanks to what the Reagans did. I see now some liberals are a little bit nostalgic. You know, Ronald Reagan was the good old days. Don't believe that for an instant.
We're in trouble. We're in trouble. And I think Stan asked a question a few minutes ago about how did these groups get disbanded? And I would just recommend, we don't normally do that in this space, but the Judas and the Black Messiah just came out. I don't know, and I apologize if you talked about it before I came on, but I mean, this is a remarkable film about Fred Hampton Jr. or Fred Hampton and his struggle for Black rights in Chicago, and how a multi-agency task force, you know, they assassinated him. And what people are most surprised about in the film is that Fred Hampton was 21 years old. He was 21 years old, and Hoover said he was an enemy. He scared Hoover because he had the original Rainbow Coalition. He was getting together poor whites in Chicago. He was getting together farm workers and the young lords and the brown berets. He was getting all of those factions together. And that's, I think, what is most frightening to the powers that be in this country, is if we all sort of stop looking up for the answer to our problems and looking to each other, which gets me to Mike Coholt's his comment in the Q&A section. Did you see it, Stan? Would you like me to read it?
Mary, can I just say one thing about
Yes.
about Fred Hampton here?
Yes.
So Fred Hampton was assassinated by the Chicago police with the help of the FBI in December of 1969. And this made it clear to all of us who were here in LA, movement people, in December 1969, that there was a national campaign to destroy the Panthers, and that the LA Panthers had to be on J. Edgar Hoover's list. And indeed, just a couple of weeks after the police raided the Panther apartment where Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, who was also killed by the police that night, they shot 80 bullets into this apartment where Fred Hampton was sleeping, killed 2 and injured many. We said LA has to be next. The LA Panthers knew that, so they fortified their office in South Central, waiting for the attack to come. And sure enough, but what happened in LA was like 1,000 times bigger than what happened in Chicago. The nation's first SWAT squad went into action. The LAPD attacking the LA Panthers office in South Central, fired, I think, 8,000 bullets into that, bombed them from the roof, shot tear gas into the building. But they were prepared for this. They had sandbagged their door and their windows, and they held out for hours. And the community, eventually thousands of community people gathered in the block around there, including Angela Davis and the other members of the Che Lumumba caucus. It was a historic, the attack came at dawn, and finally, when all the media arrived, the Panthers surrendered, walked out. Nobody had been killed. Some of them had been injured. They were young. They were very young. They were in their teens and 20s. And Angela then the next day and the Che Lumumba caucus led a big march down to LA City Hall to protest this. I think, Mike, you were part of that, weren't you?
Well, it's an amazing demonstration. Again, this was a period when the Panthers were broadening their membership, recruiting a lot of veterans and workers. But that demonstration at the City Hall, the only thing I can compare it with is I was in Belfast the day that Bobby Sands died. And there was a rally in Belfast, which you felt was like, there's the Winter Palace. This is 1917. The revolution's going to happen in 10 minutes. It felt like that in downtown LA because it brought hundreds and hundreds of kids out of the community you've never seen before at protests. It was the birth of a new power, or what could have been a new power, but for the disruptions that occurred inside the Panthers itself. It was an absolutely electric demonstration, together with the Chicano moratorium. And I've been to hundreds and hundreds of protests in my life, together with the Chicano moratorium. It's the thing that still shines in my mind when I think about that period.
So Mary, thanks for reminding us about Fred Hampton and Judas and the Black Messiah, playing now on HBO Max. We're going to talk about it on We're going to talk about it on KPFK tomorrow.
Are you? Did I give you that idea, or did you already have that?
I just finished taping. I just finished taping that earlier today. So I'm very up on Fred Hampton right now.
No, I mean, I was just so moved by this movie, and if you have, there's so much bad information about the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, or all of those groups that formed in the 60s. But if you want to know the truth about the Black Panther Party, watch this movie. Watch this movie. It is absolutely amazing, well put together. And all of these events that you all are talking about, I remember because I lived at 98th Street. Will Rogers Park was at 101st Street. And I remember the troops gathering at Will Rogers Park. They had their bivouac at Will Rogers Park after the riots of '65, and infamous Chief Parker. Did you guys talk about Chief Parker at all?
Briefly.
You did. Oh yeah,
Stan knows about Chief Parker.
Stan, all right, yeah, we can't go without mentioning Chief Parker. But I think
what a gangster.
Sorry.
What a gangster.
Oh, gangster. Yeah. Gangster without the R. Gangsta. He was a gangster.
Yeah, okay. I grew up in Riverside, and the street over from where I lived had 2 homes that were occupied by the Black Panthers.
Mm-hmm.
And so one night, I guess, I don't know how everybody in the neighborhood knew that they were going to get hit by the police.
Mm-hmm.
And so they strategically placed people all up and down the street with arms ready to go. And when the police got there, they pretty much ambushed the police. It was quite a shootout and quite a, so that was right in Riverside. I was right the next block over, hearing the gunshots, and everyone was saying, "Stay away from there, stay down." So, and another thing I just wanted to say,
it's hard to describe because there was such fear, there was just such repression,
hatred.
Hatred. When the cops rode down my street in LA, it was not, officer friendly. And all the kids knew it. The kids didn't go, gathering around the cop car. And when I hear cops say, I love my community, cops don't say that about South Central LA or East LA. They see it. They see us as enemies. And I think it's, the sooner we realize that, the better we can make policing better. We don't necessarily want to totally defund, but we want to crack those unions, and which we've talked several times about in this series. We want to crack those unions, and we want to get some good people, some good leaders in there, and change the rules of policing. We need to stop arresting people for drugs. And
Mary?
Yes, Mike.
Would you forgive me if I briefly ask Stan a question?
No, not at all.
Stan, did you know Gary Lawton?
I did. I didn't know him personally, but I knew him. Yes.
I spent 2 years going to his trials in Riverside. Gary Lawton was this extraordinary community activist in Riverside who was accused of killing 2 cops. He was tried, well, I think ultimately he was tried 4 times, wasn't he?
Yeah,
3
4
times hung jury, and 4th got him off. But the atmosphere in that courtroom, the attitude of the Riverside police, the stories that emerged about the treatment of people in the African-American neighborhoods of Riverside, this is something I'll never forget, as well as he was an extraordinary figure. He was among, one of the, probably one of the strongest, most, noble people I've ever met in my life. Former combat veteran, but an absolute warrior, fearless. This is a really important story. There's a book about it.
Yes.
Written by, of all people, the Washington Post famous editor, Ben Bradley. I think the book was written by his son. And anybody in Riverside or San Bernardino who wants to find out more about it, check out the Gary Lawton story.
My best friend was driving, had the same car that was described as getting away from the scene of the shooting. And so me and my buddies, we were pulled over 5 times in a 24-hour period. And the evening we were going out to dinner with our girlfriends, we were all dressed up, and the cops had us laying on the dirt, spread eagle, in our nice new clothes. That was a Lawton thing, the Christensen and Teal murders, or ambush, they call it.
It happened a lot, yeah.
So yeah, I was part of that.
Let's read one comment I think that we can go out on if our guests will answer that question. In my long stay in California, this is from a professor in our College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. In my long stay in California, I've been disillusioned by its carefully constructed progressive image hiding a deeply conservative reality. No problem there. There's no united front progressive movement in our state, but I'm deeply moved and committed to supporting the Poor People's Campaign, whose movement philosophy is, I believe, our best bet for a genuine progressive push. What do you see out there? I've never heard of the Poor People's Campaign. Have you guys?
Well, I think you may be referring to Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, which still exists.
Oh, it does. Oh,
Yeah.
Maybe that's what he was referring to. Yeah, I think with a lot of, I know that I'll get a lot of questions from my students about what do we do? You know, where do we go from here? You all have messed up the world for us, you old fogies, you old baby boomers. And so now what do we do? How do we fix the world? And go ahead and give them your 1 second, your 1 minute answer, John.
Well, the Black, I said it a little earlier, I'll just repeat very briefly. The Black Lives Matter movement is so much better than anything we had in the 60s, so much broader, so much more diverse, and so much more skilled at combining street protest and politics. You don't see that very often in American history, but you know, in LA, it was Black Lives Matter that managed to elect a progressive DA, and you know, George Gascon is really going to change the way the police conduct, the way police conduct criminal investigations, and the way the courts function and the way sentencing functions in LA. And that's directly because of what Black Lives Matter did here over the last year. So I'm very optimistic and hopeful that about the changes that are underway and that have already begun.
Of course, Gascon is getting pushback, though.
Of course, that shows he's doing something.
Yeah, I think he's scaring a lot of folks, and I think there's one judge that actually overturned
some of it, temporarily, at least.
What do you think, Mike?
I think we need to address a question that's, for some reason, it's seldom raised in discussions about what is to be done. How do we build united fronts? How do we achieve greater unity? And that is the imperative need to support organizing and movement careers for poor young people, for working class young people. I worked for a whole number of years with an extraordinary guy named Michael Zinzon in Pasadena, a former Black Panther, one of the people who was most key to the gang truce that emerged after 1992. And he'd built something that's equivalent to an ark, because he had this whole group of young people, of kids, and they were as poor as possible, from the projects, or from poor families. He worked nonstop on questions of shelter, providing food, getting money. The Pasadena police, in a particular appalling incident, knocked his eye out when he was observing the beating of a young person. He won a big settlement. He used it to take kids to Brazil to meet Black activists in Brazil. He started a local TV program, public access program, but he always insisted to everybody. He said, look, you talk about the working class, you talk about the street kids, but what tends to happen is these organizations get dominated by people who have resources. Graduate students are one group that immediately comes to mind when you look at things like, Occupy New York. In other words, the organizations of resistance in the left need to look a lot more like the people who are actual fighters in the movement. And to make that possible, we need to do everything we can to, create slots, positions, temporary or permanent, for people to become organizers, to invest their tremendous energy and passion, for struggle in a way that also, satisfies, all the daily needs. And the truth is that on the higher organizational level, an awful lot of the American life doesn't look like the mass base of Black Lives Matter or, other popular movements. That has to change.
I'm gonna read a statement. We're kind of gonna come to our end here, but I want to just read this statement. It says, "I'm not a question, But last year I found my voice. I attended Black Lives Matter protests, and I've organized my own protest as well. I had no experience. My first few protests, no one would show up, but with time, I ended up creating a small group. I was a very shy person, but I could not keep quiet anymore. I'm standing strong and here fighting for both Black and Latino communities going through police brutality and family separation at the border. Stay strong.
That's great, Evelyn.
What a great
Beautiful,
comment.
beautiful.
That's great.
Beautiful. That's one of our students.
Yes.
And I think there's no better way for us to close out than that.
Well, guys,
Thank you both very much.
if you haven't
Thank you both for coming.
if you haven't written it down in your notes already, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s, co-authored by Mike and John, Mike Davis and Jon Wiener.
Wiener.
Yes. I kept saying Wiener every time I read the book. Definitely get a chance to get a copy. It's one that I'll be referencing for years to come. If you haven't gained a lot of context from what we've spoken on, if you haven't got a chance to read it, definitely it's one to put on your bookshelf.
And when we return to normal, we'd like to have you guys on campus. I think our students, you know, a wider audience would certainly benefit
Definitely.
from your knowledge.
Well, Marlo and Mary and Stan, I think we've really loved this hour with you. We don't get to do this often enough, and thanks so much for inviting us.
And what time is the discussion of Fred Hampton tomorrow? I need to know that. I need to know.
Thursday beginning at 3 on KPFK 90.7
Thursday
FM.
at 3. Yeah, a lot of our students don't know about KPFK, so I encourage them. 90.7 tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
We also have a segment with Kelly Little Hernandez and the UCLA getting the LA Police Archives, including all the use of force archives. So that's an interesting segment too.
Definitely check it out. All right, everyone. We'll see you later. Take care.